In this lecture, we're going to look at the relationship of language and identity. And I'm going to do this in two parts. And just before I begin, here are some of the factors that affect identity. And you can pause this, and you can, or pause at any time, and go back to this particular screen and rate your own identity according to these factors. So you can score it from 1 to 10, and I've given you a list of factors which affect our identities, our cultural identities. It could be the city or town you come from. It could be the region. Appalachia may play an important part in your identity. It may be the state that you identify with, which is part of your identity. It could be your nationality or your ethnicity. Do you identify with a particular group? Italian Americans, African American, Hispanic, German Americans. Do you have an identity that you take from that, and how important is it to you? So you can particularly rate the importance there from 1 to 10. Race, is that a particular important factor in deciding your identity? What about religion? Family? Gender? Does that play an important part in who you are? And we can also think of sexual orientation too, and languages. Do the languages you speak have an effect upon your identity? Are the groups, or the group that you belong to, that you identify with? And I've left some other spaces there for other particular factors you can fill in for yourself. So that's something to think about during the lecture. So I'm going to talk about our different particular factors in terms of language and cultural identity. So is cultural identity determined by the language we speak? And I'm going to break this up into 5 parts. So in the first part, we'll talk about language and language in general. And then we'll talk about particular dialects. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'll talk about group identity in terms of discourse communities, and I'll touch on race, language, and nationality again. And then finally, I'm going to look at the notion of brand identity, especially with regard to being a fan of a sports team. So, in the beginning, so the myth goes, we all spoke the same language. And so you probably know this particular story about Babel, or Babylon, was a city that united humanity in a single language. And that's the particular story in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. But the people decided their city should have a very big tower, so immense that it would have its top in the heavens. Well, God wasn't too pleased about this, according to the story, and so God decided to confuse their languages and scattered the people throughout the earth. And so this is the myth, the legend of the creation of the many different languages. It's a retribution for daring to build a tower up to the heavens. The first are some of the first concepts which related language to culture were developed in 18th century Germany, 18th and 19th century Germany, as part of that particular attempt to unify the German nation. Germany wasn't really a unified nation until about 1870. It's a very new nation. Before that, it was a series of smaller smaller principalities. And the idea of trying to unite these different areas together, one of the ways that that notion of a nationhood was determined and supported was the idea that a common language determined a common nation. And two of the players in this were Johann Gottfried Herder, and he was one of the first to argue that language determined thought. So we've heard before about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, two linguists who were talking about the relationship of language determining thought. Preceding that, Herder wasn't a linguist, but he was very much into the notion of a German identity. And what made a German? Well, Germans spoke the language, the common language of German. And here's a quote from Herder: "Providence wonderfully separated nationalities." So it's, if you remember the story of Babel we just talked about, God actually was punishing humans for daring to have the hubris to build this tower to heaven, whereas now Herder turns that myth around and suggests, well, this is wonderful that God decided to break us all into these different languages. So Providence wonderfully separated nationalities, not only by woods and mountains, seas and deserts, rivers and climates, but more particularly by the languages, inclinations, and characters. Similarly, Fichte goes on, "It's not because men dwell between certain mountains and rivers that they are people, but on the contrary, men dwell together because men," and hopefully women too, men and women dwell together because they were a people already by a law of nature, which is much higher. Thus was the German nation placed sufficiently united within itself by a common language and a common way of thinking. So, very clearly, we do exist, according to Fichte, as common groups bound together by common language and common thinking. Here's an example of how someone could fall outside of that freedom to speak in one's own language and feel part of one's nation. This is the Haitian poet Edward Laforêt, and he died in the most bizarre of circumstances. He killed himself. He committed suicide by tying a Larousse dictionary, that's the French dictionary, around his neck and jumping off a bridge to protest, to expose how the French language imposed upon him by colonists had killed him artistically. So that's an example of linguistic imperialism where, of course, Laforêt was not allowed to speak his native language and therefore not allowed, according to Fauré, to be able to think freely and express his nationality. So linguistic imperialism, and another word for this is linguicism, is really the unfair treatment of an individual based solely on their use of language. Once we establish this particular notion that language is connected to culture, then we can deny other people's culture, according to this particular theory, by denying their language. An example of this, of course, is the British colonial rule in Ireland. And way up until quite recently, in a sense, 150 years ago, 1871, in the national school system in Ireland, Irish, Gaelic, the Celtic language, was prohibited and only English taught by order of the British government. And of course, there are lots and many examples of linguicism or linguistic imperialism throughout the world. Similarly to imperialism, linguistic imperialism, that is imposing language on others as a requirement of being part of a culture, is the notion of linguistic nationism. This suggests that a nation can only be a nation if it speaks one language. The ancient Greeks had this word barbarian, and barbarian was used by Greeks to call anyone who didn't speak Greek. So if you didn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. Today, of course, we understand barbarian as being uncivilized. Well, that's what the Greeks were suggesting. But the origin of it was, you don't speak Greek, therefore you're a barbarian. And we know that there are many institutions which are determined to protect the language spoken in a nation, and really to maintain that there only should be one particular language that's spoken. So we have organizations like the Académie Française, which is an attempt, difficult attempt to do, to maintain, quote-unquote, the purity of the language. And similarly in the United States, we have the English-only movement, and you'll see some posters for the English-only movement. Unfortunately, they don't appear to be able to spell very well, but that's okay. But so their idea, of course, is that only English can be spoken in the United States. And that's the notion of linguistic nationism. To the contrary, what we do is find evidence that suggests that language and culture are not that close determinants. Despite what is maintained by those German nationalists that we've just looked at, Herder and Fichte, and apart from what English-only movement claim, there's not always a one-to-one relationship between language and culture. So, for example, here's a study of Belize, Belize in South America, and what we find there that people with different ethnicities, and it's a very highly multilingual lingual society, Spanish, Creole, Maya, Belizean, and depending on whether they identify as people belonging to those ethnic groups, mainly on features such as physical appearance, genetic descent, etc. So those are what determines, in a sense, belonging to particular ethnic groups, not the language that is spoken, right? So rarely is language used as an ethnically defining criteria. The same ethnic group may speak many different languages. Another example of this is here in the United States, and that's if we look at the Gullah community, which is based down there where on the coastal area of South Carolina, a little bit of Georgia below it, and a little bit of North Carolina as well. There are now about 250,000 Gullah speakers currently speaking Gullah. Gullah is an English-based Creole. That means that the matrix language, the main language, is English, but it's highly influenced by West African languages. And it's a Creole similar to what you will find in parts of the West Indies. The point to be made here is that despite a lot of language loss, there used to be a lot more than 250,000 Gullah speakers, the culture has been maintained. It's been maintained with language loss. A lot of the loss has come about because of work practices, females tend to move out of the area and get jobs as teachers and maids, and so their particular language tends to be standardized. It becomes standard English. Males who do more physical labor stay at home, and those are the ones who maintain the particular language, the particular dialect. But it doesn't matter whether you're a Gullah speaker or not. If you were brought up in that particular community, then your culture will still very much be that of the Gullah. So it's not language that determines the culture, it's other features. So the culture can survive, the same as in Ireland, despite the loss of the language, the original language. Interesting little point there about the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thomas. He was raised as a Gullah speaker, and he's got a reputation of not saying a lot on the Supreme Court. And when he was asked why he has little to say during the hearings of the court, he said that when he was a kid, the ridicule that he experienced because he was a Gullah speaker taught him to develop the habit of listening rather than speaking in public. If we broaden this out a little bit more and go back to the notion of language and culture, we think of countries like Spain as being linguistically homogeneous. But not everybody in Spain speaks Spanish, of course. In that particular part down the bottom there, Catalonia, the local language is Catalan. And there has been a lot of separatist movements, especially with the development of the European Union. And a lot of these small particular regions begin to express their identity by adhering more to their particular local languages. And I don't know if it's going to happen, but there has been suggestions that Catalonia may vote to leave Spain, and if that came about, of course, they'd have a separate football association, and we wouldn't have the national team of Spain as we know it, although considering the kinds of players who play for Barcelona, they probably would be a pretty good team. It's also interesting to think about the kinds of stereotypes that we have in terms of nationality and language, and how those particular stereotypes begin by focusing on a particular feature, and that particular feature is diffused to the larger group. There's an interesting quote from Sir Alex Ferguson, used to be the most successful manager, of course, in British soccer, manager of Manchester United, now retired for several years. And his team were playing against Bayern Munich in the Championship League, and they lost. And he was very upset about an incident in the game where one of his players was sent off. Okay, so this is what he said. There's no doubt about it, Ferguson told ITV when asked if the dismissal had changed the course of the game. They were never getting through that tie. With 11 men, we had no problem. The young boy, that's the player who got sent off, showed a bit of inexperience, but they got him sent off. Everyone sprinted towards the referee. Typical Germans. Okay? Typical Germans is a cultural stereotype expressed by the English, of course, mainly, that the Germans don't play fair. They're not sporting. Well, that's the stereotype, of course. But the interesting thing here, if you look at that picture of the Bayern Munich players, what you'll begin to notice is that very few of them are actual Germans. The manager of the team at the time was Louis van Gaal, of course, who's Dutch. And Frank Ribéry is there in the picture, number 7. Of course, he's French. And you have several other Dutch players. In fact, in that team, I think there was about only 4 or 5 Germans. But we have these surviving cultural stereotypes based upon nationality and based upon language. Okay, the second thing, or second area I'm going to look at here in this particular part of the talk is the notion of dialect. That is not so much the language as a whole in terms of nationality, but the particular types of variations in terms of how that language is spoken in terms of dialect. Okay, so you're listening to me talking now, and you can ask yourself, well, how does my dialect vary from yours? And you've probably been listening and you got an idea of various ways I say things, various ways words I use, and maybe particular grammar I use, which distinguish the way I talk from the way you talk. And we can pick some of those out. I'm from Manchester, and you can see on the map there, you'll see a ring around Liverpool, and if you just come inland 30 miles, you get to Manchester. And that is my regional dialect. Well, I say it's my regional dialect. That's where I was born and grew up and lived for about 20 years. And then, of course, I moved away, went to college in London, and eventually left England. And so it's about 35 more years since I've lived in England. And so the way I speak, of course, is a blend, a mixture of all those different kind of linguistic experiences I've had, and the way I identify with the places that I live now. But you can look at certain things about my dialect, like phonology, the way I say words. So you can listen to the way I say but, bush, book, bus, money, and you'll find that the vowel sound there is kind of different to the way that you guys say things and the way that maybe other people say things. It's a specific trait of that particular Manchester dialect. You might also find that I say words, I use different words with different meanings. One of the problem words that I've often gotten into trouble with is being in the classroom and looking around for a rubber and maybe saying, has anyone got a rubber? Has anyone seen a rubber? And of course in an American classroom, that's greeted with incredulous looks and nudges. And did he really say that? No, I don't mean a rubber in that sense. I mean an eraser. It's a different word. There also may be differences in terms of grammar. For example, the third conditional, if I had known you were coming, I would have baked a cake. It tends to be in American grammar, you'd say, if I would have known you were coming, I should have baked a cake. Okay, so you learn a lot about me from the way I speak in terms of phonology, choice of words, and the particular grammar I use. Perhaps the person that I perhaps sound like, and you can you can click on that link there later and have a listen to Graham Nash. Graham Nash of Crosby, Stills and Nash. He was from Manchester. He was born in Manchester a few years before I was born, and he left Britain when he was in his early 20s, mid-20s. He moved to North America. He married Joni Mitchell, the Canadian singer, and lived most of his life in the United States. So if you listen to the way he speaks, just have a listen and ask yourself, are there similarities to the way I speak? Because we both had a very similar life experience. Dialects and standard pronunciation, standard language, can be considered in terms of a linguistic market. Okay? So the right linguistic variety can transform a worthless utterance into a prize one. In other words, one's linguistic variety can ultimately enhance one's chances for material gain. Now, I experienced this when I first came to the United States, and sometimes it still happens now, that people would say, "Oh, you have an accent," and most Americans, when they hear the way I speak, would have considered me to be, whoa, highly intelligent, and whoa, are you from the nobility? Well, of course I'm not. I mean, I come from a working class family. My particular dialect is originally working class, and of course I'm not that intelligent, but my particular variety of speaking in the United States has had a certain value, a certain symbolic value. And the more I go towards the west, to the west coast, that symbolic value seems to have got even higher. So when I lived in California for a while, then I was treated as being the most intelligent of people. When people didn't know me, of course. Once they got to know me, then they began to think, oh yeah, right, okay, now I know. He's not as smart as I thought he was, by the sound of his voice. So that is the notion of the linguistic market. Standard pronunciation, standard language, right, may have a particular value in particular markets, particular institutions. So if you're going for a job, then the way to speak is the standard way, right? Sound like a Harvard man or whatever it is, right? And so the standard pronunciation, the prize pronunciation, has that particular value. But at the same time, if you're operating in a smaller situation, if you're going back to your hometown because it's spring break, you know that if you speak like in a standard way, people will say, who's he? You know, why is he putting all those airs and graces on? Once you speak in the local vernacular, then you're more accepted. So in a local situation, the local vernacular has a lot more symbolic value than standard pronunciation. So the way we speak is valued in different ways in different situations. And here's an example of how language and dialect can change to express that local versus national or institutional distinction. This is a study done by a very famous linguist, Labov, and it goes back quite a long time now. And what he studied was the local dialect on Martha's Vineyard. So Martha's Vineyard is this island much favored by presidents as a place to go vacation. It's off the coast of Massachusetts. And what he discovered when he looked at this, the local pronunciation, the local dialect, that it tended to get more and more extreme, or when I say extreme, it tended to distinguish itself more and more, especially through the pronunciation of particular phonemes, particular vowels. So fight became foit, and about became about. And so what Labov found was that this was becoming more and more marked. And what he related it to was the change in the dynamic on the island. Martha's Vineyard became very popular in the 60s as a place to have a holiday home or second home. So he had lots of people coming into the island. So he had two groups. You had the locals and then you had the visitors, the people from outside. So one way of expressing your identity, that you were a local, and maybe expressing some opposition to all these rich people coming in and building these big houses, was to develop a very distinct way of speaking, distinct from the people who were coming in, the outsiders. So in that situation, the local pronunciation would give you great symbolic value in terms of the local people, as distinct from the people who are coming in for their 2 weeks or 3 weeks vacation in their big houses. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, the end of part 1, and in part 2 we'll continue talking about the relationship between language and identity.